A 6-foot piece of sharpened wood, that was the secret weapon starving, desperate king used to destroy the flower of French chivalry. The story of Agincourt is not about courage, it's about a genius hack planted in the mud. But was this deadly stake wall a desperate improvisation, or a medieval myth crafted to hide the bloodiest tactical atrocity of the age? The answer starts with a forgotten march and a king facing annihilation. The year is 1415. 3 months prior, Henry V had landed in France with 10,000 men. What began with the siege of Harfleur quickly turned into a fight against disease. The English had believed the city would fall swiftly, but the defense was stubborn, and the cost was paid in time and blood, and worst of all, sickness. Dysentery, the bloody flux, tore through the English ranks, turning the victory into a disaster. The heat and the unsanitary conditions of the siege trenches created the perfect breeding ground for pestilence. Henry V's proud army was decimated by sickness, its strength sapped. The troops who remained were ghosts of the men who had landed on French shores, gaunt, weakened, and desperate for safety. With the campaigning season closing and his forces too weak to fight, Henry V made a fateful decision. He would march his remaining men to the English-held port of Calais, a journey of roughly 150 miles through enemy territory. It was a perilous gamble, a forced retreat that looked like a king abandoning his claim. He needed to reach the sea before the French nobility could organize and trap him. He had already lost nearly half his original force to death or garrison duty. His effective fighting force had dwindled to perhaps 6,000 men, many still weak and ailing. Henry V, a king driven by honor and a fierce sense of divine purpose, could not accept defeat. Retreating by sea would mean surrendering his claim and facing humiliation back home. He had to march, and in doing so, he chose the path of highest risk. The march began under an ominous sky. Day after relentless day, the English slogged through the sodden Norman countryside. Food was scarce. They were forced to forage and live off the land, which only added to the local hostility and increased their exposure to disease. The heavy autumn rains turned ancient Roman roads into churning rivers of mud, each step a Herculean effort. The men-at-arms, clad in steel, found their expensive armor was now a crippling burden. Their horses, too, suffered greatly, sinking to their knees in the mire. They were an army on the edge of collapse, starved, sick, and demoralized. The only thing that kept them moving was the sheer, stubborn will of their king. News of the English's slow, painful crawl quickly reached the French court. The Dauphin and the powerful dukes had gathered an immense army, easily numbering between 20,000 and 30,000 men. These were fresh, magnificently armored troops, brimming with confidence and national pride. The French nobility, having largely missed the siege of Harfleur, were eager to crush the English invaders and redeem the honor of France. Their arrogance was palpable. They saw Henry V's desperate march as an opportunity, a chance to trap the weakened English king and deliver a decisive, glorious blow that would end the war once and for all. They fully intended to bring the English king back to Paris in chains. But Henry knew a battlefield secret the French pride wouldn't allow them to see. The French shadowed the English, constantly looking for the opportune moment to strike, first denying them passage across the Somme River. Henry, ever the shrewd tactician, managed to find a shallow crossing at the village of Agincourt, barely slipping his forces across. It was a brief reprieve, a brilliant maneuver that bought his men a day of rest, but the French were relentless. Their larger, faster army quickly moved ahead, successfully blocking Henry V's path to Calais. On October 24, 1415, as the English army emerged near the village of Agincourt, they saw it. Spread across the narrow plain ahead, blocking their every avenue of escape, was the full might of France. A glittering, terrifying host, a sea of banners and shining armor. Henry V's exhausted 6,000 were now truly trapped, facing an enemy that outnumbered them by at least 4 to 1, possibly more. For the English, there was no retreat, only the desperate choice of battle or certain capture and subsequent execution. This grim confrontation was the culmination of weeks of suffering. Henry V faced the ultimate test of leadership, surrounded by an overwhelming enemy. He walked among his ragged men, their faces etched with weariness and fear, and he knew that salvation would not come from divine intervention alone, but from a desperate, ingenious plan, one that few in the French high command could have foreseen. The king's strategy would rely on the despised commoner, the English longbowman, whose simple, unexpected defense would turn the grand French charge into a tactical nightmare. It was a weapon that cost nothing, weighed nothing, and shattered the French heavy cavalry. Consider hitting that subscribe button if you're enjoying this deep dive into history's most gripping tales. Your support helps us uncover more incredible stories like Henry V's fight for survival. As night fell over the field of Agincourt, the English knew their fate would be decided by dawn. While the French spent their night feasting, confident in their assured victory and gambling over the spoils, Henry V's army was busy crafting a weapon that did not use iron or gunpowder, a simple, wooden hack that would defy the very nature of medieval warfare. Across the mud-soaked fields, two armies prepared for dawn. But while the French spent the night reveling, the English were preparing the ground. Their work was quiet, determined, and entirely focused on creating a fatal imbalance in the laws of physics and chivalry. The field Henry V had chosen was crucial. He positioned his army at the neck of the narrow Agincourt plain, barely 1,000 yards wide. This natural bottleneck, bordered by dense woods, eliminated the massive advantage of the French numbers. It meant the French would have to attack frontally, sacrificing their ability to flank the smaller English force. Further ensuring disaster for the French was the land itself. The heavy rains had saturated the newly ploughed clay fields, transforming the entire arena into a treacherous, sucking bog. The ground was already saturated, waiting to become a quagmire beneath the immense weight of the French advance. At the heart of Henry V's strategy were his archers. They made up roughly 4/5 of his remaining force. They were lightly armored, often wearing simple leather jerkins or no armor at all, and thus were highly vulnerable to a determined cavalry charge, the most common method of clearing a battlefield for the knights. Protecting them was paramount. This is where Henry V's genius emerged. As the final hours of the night ticked by, he ordered his longbowmen to cut and sharpen wooden stakes. These were not mere branches. They were robust 6-foot-long spears, sharpened at both ends, and often hardened for maximum durability. The men worked tirelessly using their woodsman's axes and daggers, creating thousands of these improvised, lethal defenses. The command was to hammer these 6-foot stakes into the wet earth in front of the archer's position, angled forward at 45 degrees. This created a subtle, barely visible defensive barrier, a low, hidden hedge of sharpened wood. The sodden ground absorbed the lower ends of the stakes, making them almost invisible in the pre-dawn gloom and the ankle-deep mud. This was a critical military innovation that redefined the battlefield. In the heat of a cavalry charge, the French horse would not see the barrier until it was too late. The resulting momentum of the heavy warhorse would drive the animal's chest directly onto the sharpened point, impaling and toppling it, creating instant chaos. Historical accounts are debated. Was this a desperate, brilliant improvisation, a masterstroke of adaptation unique to Henry V, or was it standard English protocol for protecting their most valuable weapon? The sheer scale and crucial timing of their use at Agincourt transformed it into the ultimate tactical hack. It demonstrated Henry V's profound understanding of his enemy. The French expected a fair fight between noble knights. Henry gave them a peasant's trap. As the sun began to rise on the 25th of October, revealing the immense, gleaming power of the French host, the thin English line stood ready. The archers, many of them having shed their clothes to fight without the hindrance of even light mail, gripped their bow staves. In front of them, hidden in the mud, lay the silent, deadly hedge of spears, waiting to receive the fury of French chivalry. The French, having surveyed the field, saw only the woods, the narrow gap, and the vulnerable archers. They failed to notice the simple wooden trick that Henry V had planted in the clay. The signal to begin the slaughter, however, would come not from the French, whose confidence was their undoing, but from the desperate audacity of the English king himself. The French cavalry, 1,000 men of shining armor and peerless strength, began their charge. They had one job: shatter the archers. But they did not see the hidden, sharpened nightmare waiting for them. planted low in the mud, specifically designed to impale horseflesh. Dawn broke with neither side willing to make the first move. Henry, however, was in no position to wait. He had to force the engagement. In a moment of sheer audacity, Henry V gave the command, "Banners advance." The English line moved forward, advancing 300 yards into the most constricted part of the field, effectively throwing down the gauntlet and forcing the massive French nobility to react. This aggressive move worked. Seeing the English daring to challenge them, the French nobility, burning with shame and impatience, could restrain themselves no longer. The order was given. The massive French cavalry, arrayed on the flanks, thundered forward. This was the moment Henry V had prepared for. The charge began with immense power and confidence, the heavily armored riders and horses churning the already saturated field, quickly turning the mud into a viscous swamp that dragged at hooves and boots. As the French mounted knights neared the English lines, the archers, who had pulled their stakes partially free of the ground during the advance, quickly hammered them back down and secured the deadly hedge. They stepped back just behind this impromptu palisade, their longbows drawn taut. Then came the first wave of fire. The English arrow storm was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of arrows, 3 feet long, descended upon the French ranks, striking armor, penetrating gaps, and terrifying the horses. The air filled with a deadly, buzzing sound. But the sheer momentum of the charge, despite the arrows and the sucking mud, was still formidable. The first ranks of French knights closed on the English position. Then the disaster struck. The leading French horses, unable to see the stakes hidden beneath the churned mud and low grass, slammed headlong into the angled wooden spears. The sound was a sickening crunch, a violent halt to impossible speed. The stakes, planted firmly in the ground, were driven deep into the horses' chests. The animals screamed, pitching forward, throwing their heavily armored riders into the mud. The collapse of the first rank created instant, catastrophic chaos. The riders behind them could not stop, colliding with the fallen horses and men. The French cavalry, designed for a glorious, sweeping charge, was now a tangled mass of panicked horses, screaming knights, and lethal mud. The narrow gap in the field meant there was no room to maneuver around the sudden, deadly obstacle. The stakes had fulfilled their terrible purpose. They had broken the charge. Then, everything stopped. A silent, wooden trap had been sprung. With their cavalry dissolved, the French were forced to commit their primary fighting force, the dismounted men-at-arms. These were the flower of French nobility, thousands of knights and squires, encased in the finest plate armor. They began their agonizing march across the 600 yards of mud, but they had to march through the wreckage of their own charge, navigating a field littered with struggling, dying horses and their own comrades. The relentless English arrow fire continued to rain down on them, forcing them to duck their heads and advance with eyes to the ground. The French men-at-arms were already exhausted before they even raised a weapon, having spent the night in revelry, then the morning marching across a field of human and animal carnage. They were approaching the English not as a charging wave, but as a slow, heavily burdened tide of exhausted, demoralized men. If you appreciate the kind of historical detail and cinematic storytelling that brings these epic battles to life, please leave a comment below with another piece of history you think deserves this treatment. The stakes had done their job, but their role was not finished. They were not just an offensive barrier against the horses, they became a terrifying psychological and physical obstacle, channeling the entire French vanguard into a bottleneck of mud and death. The battle now transitioned to a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. The French infantry made contact with the English line, but in the worst possible condition, exhausted, compressed, and disoriented. The narrow battlefield, compounded by the presence of the English stake wall, created a disastrous compression factor for the French. The advancing thousands were squeezed into an ever-tightening formation. The leading ranks fell, crushed under the weight of their own numbers. The men behind them stumbled, unable to see or swing their weapons effectively. The dense press of bodies meant that many French knights died not from an English weapon, but from suffocation and exhaustion, simply drowning in the press of men and the deep mud. The stakes became crucial again, not as a static defense, but as a mobile, aggressive shield. The English archers, their quivers nearly empty, dropped their bows and seized the battlefield. They did not retreat. Instead, they swarmed around the edges of the English men-at-arms, using the 6-foot stakes they had created as improvised pikes and spears. This was the ultimate defiance of chivalry, the unarmored commoners engaging the armored elite. The stakes allowed the archers to maintain distance and stab at the weakest points of the armor. More significantly, the remaining stakes in the ground acted as a series of low hurdles and trip hazards. The heavily armored French, struggling through the mud, constantly tripped and fell. Once a knight was down, his armor became a trap. He was too heavy to rise quickly, and the English archers moved in for the execution. The French, struggling to reach the English line, found themselves in a physical and psychological nightmare. The mud weighed down their movement, and the sheer mass of their own army pinned them in place. They were suffocated, drowned, and exhausted before the English swords even had to work. The weight of their own armor became their greatest burden. By midday, the core of the French attack had collapsed. Thousands lay dead, but thousands more were simply pinned, unable to move. It was a victory won not by superior numbers, but by Henry V's brilliant understanding of terrain, psychology, and the absolute vulnerability of heavily armored men on a muddy field. The battlefield was a swamp of carnage, and the English now faced a gruesome decision: what to do with the thousands of captured, high-value French nobles and men-at-arms who now lay helpless on the field. The final, terrible act of the battle was about to begin. The battle was won, but the story of the 6-foot spears was just beginning. It became the ultimate tale of the underdog, an enduring legend. As the main French force lay broken, 2 new French assaults threatened the English rear. Henry V, looking at his meager force exhausted, surrounded by 20,000 and 30,000 French bodies, and holding thousands of prisoners, feared the ultimate disaster. If the prisoners rose up or were rescued, the English would be instantly overwhelmed. In a move that defined the madness and desperation of the moment, Henry V gave the most controversial order of his career: unalive the prisoners. This was a profound violation of the era's chivalric code, but Henry saw a non-negotiable military necessity. He ordered a detachment of 200 archers to unalive the vast majority of the captives. It was a brutal, pragmatic act of war that secured the English victory. The remaining French threats were soon put down, and the Grand Army of France, utterly routed, retreated. The scale of the French loss was staggering. Estimates placed the French dead at 6,000 or more, including 3 dukes, 8 counts, and 90 barons. The English loss was estimated at only a few hundred. The victory at Agincourt cemented Henry V's legend. The stakes were the hack that won the day, but the enduring legacy is that history is often won not by the largest armies, but by the smallest, most ingenious, and sometimes the most brutal decisions. Thank you for watching. Share this video with a friend who loves the story of the ultimate underdog, and subscribe to join our community as we continue to explore the past.